Hello, everybody. Um, Settle down. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Carl Goodman. I'm the president and CEO of the Florida Holocaust Museum. Welcome to our commemoration of Kristallnacht. I believe this is a program that is meaningful every year. It's especially meaningful to me because it's my first program here of Kristallnacht. I'll tell you a little bit about the event. But first, whether you're a visitor off the street, a member, or a donor, or a docent, or a board member, or all five, thank you so much for all you do for us. We're really grateful and we're really happy that you're here. I want to especially point out we have two board members here tonight, Tony Rindy, as well as Thomas Smith. Dr. Smith, there you are. Thank you for everything you do for the museum. We also have Sandy Mermelstein, who is happens to be the daughter of the founder of this museum, Wally Lobenberg. So on November 9th and 10th, 1938, about 85 years ago, the Nazis unleashed a fury of state-sponsored terrorism, pogroms against the Jews in Germany and in Austria. Taking place in a few short hours, thousands of synagogues, Jewish businesses, and homes were damaged and destroyed. This event became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, which refers to the broken shop windows of Jewish-owned stores that covered the streets. The given pretext for this violence was the November 7th assassination in Paris of German diplomat Ernst von Brath by Herschel Grunspan, a Jewish teenager whose parents, along with 17,000 other Polish Jews, had been expelled from the Reich. The next day, an inflammatory editorial appeared in the official Nazi press, and sporadic anti-Jewish rioting began. In preparation for the actions to come and to ensure that Jews could not fight back effectively, police entered Jewish homes and removed anything that the residents could use to defend themselves. Though portrayed as a spontaneous outburst of popular outrage, these pogroms were calculated acts of retaliation carried out by the SA, the SS, and local Nazi Party organizations. That night, instructions were conveyed to all parts of the country to encourage participation in the atmosphere of outrage. Mass frenzy broke out. Synagogues were destroyed and burned. Shop windows of Jewish-owned stores were shattered, looted, and demolished. Jewish homes were destroyed, and in many places Jews were physically attacked. 267 synagogues were destroyed, and 30,000 Jews were arrested, among whom I found out is the founder of the Florida Holocaust Museum, Walter Lobenberg. And they were often aided by pre-existing lists of names. This was the first time that riots against the Jews of Germany had been organized at such an extensive scale. These actions were accomplished also by mass detentions. So here we are, marking the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And now I'd like to introduce the board chair of the Florida Holocaust Museum, Michael Eagle.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on such an important night. I just wanted to take a, excuse me, a few minutes to really just piggyback, so to speak, onto Carl's words. He set the context for why we're here in terms of 85 years ago tonight, what was done to the Jews. And I want to really even just bring that a little bit more into the fore, especially in light of how many of us are living today and why the lessons of the Holocaust are so important and how they have such real-time impact on all of us and should. We often say that the Holocaust was a blueprint for what happens when the world is silent, but it's also the blueprint for what happens when the world stands up and upstanders do what they're supposed to do, which is make the right decision and do positive things regardless of circumstance. Many of you have heard me say that I exist because of that, as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. People who weren't Jewish, who did what many others wouldn't have done and didn't do, which is the right thing. And in today's world, I think of these parallels. We are very careful here not to create Holocaust equivalencies. That said, we do use the lessons to draw parallels when they're appropriate. And we think of things like victim blaming, which is rampant right now. Kristallnacht, many don't know, but one of the lessons of the Holocaust involves Kristallnacht, one of the many lessons. The Jews who were the victims of Kristallnacht were forced to pay for the damages of the destruction of their own businesses. That's victim blaming. What's happening right now? The same thing. And there are many other examples like that. So it's a perfect example of why these lessons are so important and why they have to be inside of all of us to ensure that these things do not happen again. We just experienced the largest murder of Jewish people since the Holocaust, and now we are celebrating a night and memorializing a night. I hope everybody thinks about the victims, the survivors. This is what they stood for. This is honoring them, that we're all here and honoring those lessons. And please just take it. Carl, I should also mention, Carl mentioned Walter Lobenberg, our founder, who obviously has an incredibly special place in my heart and the heart of so many others. And I know, and Sandy, I know he would often say that was the night that empowered him to make sure that he did something so nobody else would suffer what he suffered. And we're sitting in the symbol of that right now. And we're carrying forward and standing on his shoulders and the shoulders of so many others like him. And I hope everybody is thinking about that tonight and thinking about these lessons and why they're important. And please don't stay silent, because it is a very difficult time and we need everyone together. And with that, I'd like to invite Rabbi David Weitzman and Rabbi Danielle Uppen, who are my family's rabbis on top of it, so, to say a few words for the commemoration.
Good evening. Am I allowed to touch this? Stand on my toes here. Okay, so thank you, Michael. We wanted to just amplify, before we begin the official commemoration of Kristallnacht with the prayers in this packet that you have in front of you, we wanted to amplify this in spiritual language and of what we're feeling now. It's not correct, as Michael said, to lump together the Holocaust and what's happening now. This is not something we would do. We don't make parallels, but it is difficult not to feel that our feelings about those two events of what's happening now and what happened in the past are they're bound together. The feelings of being challenged, of sorrow, of suffering, and needing a little bit of healing for what's happening now and giving voice to that. So a prayer for this moment of crisis in war, and then our official commemoration of Kristallnacht. A prayer in time of war in Israel. And you don't have this in front of you, so if you want to listen or close your eyes. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our ancestors. You know that the Jewish people are one nation with one heart. And today, that heart is broken. With the grim news of so many of our sisters and brothers in Israel killed, wounded, and kidnapped, we turn to you. Harofei l'shvurei lev, the healer of broken hearts. Be with our brothers and sisters who have been taken captive, and with the families of victims. Watch over the hostages and break their bonds. Bring them from darkness to light. Comfort the families of those who are murdered. Bring them under the shelter of your wings. Bring complete healing of body and spirit to all the wounded. Bind up our wounds and grant us healing. Tzor Yisrael, rock and redeemer of the people Israel. Bless the state of Israel during this time of war and tragedy. Guide its leaders with your light and truth. Help them with your good counsel. Shield us with your love and spread over it the shelter of your peace. Shomer Yisrael, guardian of Israel, strengthen and bless the defenders of Israel and all who are striving for peace for the entire region. May the Holy One, Blessed One, preserve us, help us, and hear our prayers. May you turn our mourning into dancing and our sackcloth into robes of joy. Protect us and restore us with peace and wholeness. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you. At this time, we'd like to ask if our survivors would come forward to light the memorial candles, please. And in the second generation also, if we have children of survivors as well, please come forward.
Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hachol ve'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat adam, hachol ve'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, merak hashamayim, tfilat adam. O God, my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart.
Let's just join together, please, in these readings that we have in the flyer. A poem, Tears of Crystal, Tears of Broken Glass. Together. My tears are crystal and broken glass. They sparkle, they cut, they heal, they wound. They are daybreak and midnight. Hymn and dirge, joyous celebration and lonely mourning. My tears catch your divine light. Prisms casting colors across my days and on my hands. I pray to hold them gently, with dignity, with honor. I am one of your children, one of those you love, comforted knowing that I, too, am one for whom you cry. Tears of crystal, tears of broken glass.
Together, in the presence of eyes which witnessed the slaughter, which saw the oppression the heart could not bear, and as witnessed the heart that once taught compassion until the days came to pass that crushed human feeling, I have taken an oath to remember it all, to remember not once to forget not one thing to the last generation, when the degradation shall cease, to the last to its ending, when the rod of instruction shall have come to conclusion, an oath, not in vain passed over to the last, to its ending, when the rod of instruction shall have come to conclusion, an oath, not in vain passed over.
We join together in this prayer for peace. May we see the day when war and bloodshed cease, when a great peace will embrace the whole world. Then nation will not threaten nation, and mankind will not again know war. For all who live on earth shall realize that we have not come into being to hate or destroy. We have come into being to praise, to labor, and to love. Compassionate God, bless the leaders of all nations with the power of compassion, and fulfill the promise conveyed in our sacred texts. I will bring peace to the land, and you shall lie down, and no one will terrify you. I'll rid the land of vicious beasts, and it shall not be ravaged by war. Let love and justice flow like a mighty stream, and let peace fill the earth as the waters fill the sea. Let us say Amen.
In a moment, we'll ask you to stand. If you might want to silence your cell phones or put them on vibrate if no one has asked you to do that already. It helps us maintain our concentration and listen together, as we all know. A prayer for the 6 million, please rise. El Malei Rachamim Shochein Bamromim Hamitzei Menucha Nechona תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הקיים הצירים. לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל, שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם, מגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אנא בעל רחמים, אז תראי בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום במשכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen.
Amen. God, full of mercy, who dwells in the heights, provide a sure rest upon the divine presence wings, within the range of the holy and the pure, whose shining resembles the sky. All the souls of the 6 million Jews, victims of the European Holocaust, who were murdered, slaughtered, burnt, and exterminated for the sanctification of the name by the German Nazi assassins and their helpers from the rest of the peoples. Therefore, Master of Mercy, will protect them forever from behind the hiding of his wings, and will tie their souls with the rope of life. The everlasting is their heritage. The Garden of Eden shall be their resting place, and they shall rest peacefully upon their lying place, and they will stand for their fate in the end of days. And let us say, Amen. We remember now the 6 million by reciting the Kaddish, the traditional prayer for the dead. This prayer is not a funeral hymn, but an affirmation of God's everlasting presence and dominion, praising God's existence and creative love. It is in this spirit that we pray the Kaddish, remembering the victims of Kristallnacht. We also pray for the survivors, whose faith in life enabled them to rebuild their shattered lives, their destroyed worlds, in other countries. Joining together, they brought about new life. They raised new families and new lands. And in defiance of absolute terror and despair, they sought an invincible hope. Exalted by the spirit of faith, we pray together this evening. Please join together in the words of the Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. V'yalama tivrach yirute v'yamich malchute. V'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye d'chol Beit Yisrael. V'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevorach la'olam l'alamei l'maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shmei d'kudashah brichu. La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechamata da'amiran bi'alama v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemayim. V'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imramav. V'yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Amen.
Just stay standing for one more moment as we stand in solidarity in this pledge of Franta Bass, who perished in Auschwitz-Birkenau when he was 14 years old. Let's make his words our words together. I am a Jew, and I will be a Jew forever. Even if I die from hunger, never will I submit. I will always fight for my people on my honor. I will never be ashamed of them. I give my word. I am proud of my people. How dignified they are. Even though I am oppressed, I will always come back to life. Amen. This concludes our service. Please be seated.
Perfect words to end on. They're just perfect. And so I want to quickly introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Stacy Bernard Davis. Stacy Bernard Davis is the Deputy Envoy for Holocaust Issues at the U.S. Department of State. Excuse me. Previously, she was Deputy Director of the Office of International Religious Freedom, and prior to that, Unit Chief for Europe and Eurasia in JIRF. She also was the Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism. She joined the Religious Freedom Office in 2011 and worked with the Ambassadors at Large for International Religious Freedom and the Special Envoys to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism to advance U.S. foreign policy to promote religious freedom and combat anti-Semitism and religious discrimination in Europe. She spent the first 20 years of her career in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, working on defense trade, nuclear nonproliferation, supporting the UN Special Commission on Iraq, and developing antipersonnel landmine policy and supporting weapons remediation. She graduated from Cornell University and holds a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And we've had the opportunity to talk to each other on more than one occasion. And I just want to say that Stacy, you're somebody who, for someone like me who has a lot of conversations like ours, and I know when I'm talking to somebody who's living the work and inspiring a lot of people and so dedicated to making sure these lessons stay at the front of the world. And so on behalf of, and we think so much about the survivors and the victims tonight, on behalf of everyone in that camp, that club, including the generations after, thank you, because you're doing tremendous work and you're inspiring so many of us, and we're so lucky and thankful that you're here to do it. And I just want to add on another personal note, in the Florida Holocaust Museum's never-ending quest to bring people together, Stacy gets to see one of her closest friends in the world, Ellen Sigmund, on her trip here. So we're very excited to be able to accomplish that as well tonight. So it's so nice to see them and spend some time with them also here. So without further ado, Stacy Bernard Davis.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here tonight. Thanks to Mike, actually thanks to someone named Jackie Corcoran, who is married to a previous special envoy for Holocaust issues. We reconnected and she told me about the museum. And then I met Mike and Carl and Aaron and Helen Levine and then Miranda. So thank you for organizing this. I'm really honored to be here. And I just want to say one quick word that's interesting that I learned recently about Kristallnacht from colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in Germany in Berlin. In Germany, they're not using that word anymore because it sounds too pretty. It sounds too nice. So they're saying Pogromnacht, night of the pogrom. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Anyway, so there are some slides that, don't have any order, but you'll find out a little more about and I'll talk about what my office does as well at the State Department. So this is your taxpayer dollars at work. On a more serious note, it's 85 years to commemorate the Night of Broken Glass. And we remember that it was a preview of the horror of what was to come in the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews. And of course, we are also remembering the recent horror in Israel, when Hamas terrorists brutally slaughtered more than 1,400 Israelis and still hold more than 200 hostage, including American citizens. We would also be remiss if we didn't recognize the Palestinian people who are suffering greatly as well. We mourn the loss of innocent Palestinian lives and condemn violence against civilian populations. As the president said, what sets us apart from the terrorists is that we believe in the fundamental dignity of every human being, every human life, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Jew, Muslim, Christian. We condemn hatred in all its forms, including that which is based on real or perceived religion or beliefs. And as the president also said, and as some of you mentioned already, October 7th was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It has brought to the surface painful memories and scars left by millennia of anti-Semitism and the genocide of the Jewish people by the Nazis and their collaborators. And because of this, worldwide, we're seeing a shocking rise in anti-Semitism. In this country, in France, Germany, England, over the past month, it's alarming. And the U.S. is taking multiple actions to address this. We've been very clear. As the White House press briefing said, we can't stand by and stand silent in the face of hate. We must, without equivocation, denounce anti-Semitism. And, as I mentioned, maybe I didn't mention it, on my bio, I had worked with previous special envoys to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Deborah Lipstadt is the current special envoy, and she's been traveling just as part of what we're trying to do. She's in Germany now, and ways to talk to governments about supporting their Jewish communities, providing additional security. And at home, following the attack and subsequent university campus protests, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice have taken steps to ensure campus law enforcement is included in engagements with state and local law enforcement. And they've taken numerous steps to provide outreach and support directly to college campuses. The Department of Education is making it easier for students and others who experience anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or other kinds of discrimination to file a complaint under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And senior administration officials are meeting with Jewish leaders and universities to discuss anti-Semitism on campuses and what we're doing to counter it. And we'll continue to combat anti-Semitism and all hate-fueled violence at schools and college campuses. In recent weeks, we've seen repugnant statements that cannot stand. The Claims Conference campaign over the past couple of years, it started with words, has highlighted how hateful words turned into acts of violence. And as Holocaust survivor Marian Tursky said, Auschwitz did not fall suddenly from the skies. On this anniversary of Kristallnacht, I'm horrified to be hearing about Jews in the US and Europe who are afraid to reveal that they're Jewish. And this is a very different world from 85 years ago. As the president said, quote, "The world watched then, it knew, and the world did nothing. We will not stand by and do nothing again. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." And as we talked about this sharp rise in anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial and distortion is a kind of anti-Semitism. And it's just chilling to see that. And that is why promoting accurate Holocaust education around the world is a key aspect of my office's mission. Let me first tell you a little bit about my office and why Holocaust issues are important to the U.S. government and important to U.S. foreign policy and how they manifest themselves in today's foreign policy. It's become even more evident 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And, you know, their purported excuse was clearly Holocaust distortion. Without a shred of evidence, they said that Ukraine was a hotbed of Nazism. And that's distortion, cynically invoking its historic role in combating Nazi Germany to generate support at home for its illegal and indefensible war against Ukraine. So, back to the Holocaust. In the wake of the devastation of World War II and the Holocaust, leaders around the world came together to do something about it, to create a rules-based international order. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, all of these can be traced back to the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, himself the stepson of a Holocaust survivor, has talked about the State Department's initial failure to help refugees from Nazi-controlled Europe. Fortunately, some in the U.S. government did push back, including a group of Treasury Department officials whose advocacy resulted in the creation of the War Refugee Board in January 1944. But by then, more than 4 million Jews had already been murdered. From 1933 to 1943, we had 1.5 million visas available, a quota of 1.5 million to allow refugees to enter this country. We admitted fewer than 480,000. So more than 1 million slots went unfilled, as thousands were murdered every day, including many who were on board of the MS St. Louis in 1939. There's a small exhibit about that downstairs, and they tried to come ashore in Miami. So this is a good lesson for how we should never forget the way individuals can make entire systems from top to bottom tilt toward the inhumane, and how the sanitized language of cables, briefings, and regulations can be used to turn away people we should help. But we also mustn't forget that individuals armed with the truth and their convictions can use those same mechanisms to save lives and serve justice, even as Mike referred to the upstanders who saved, individual families that weren't, maybe they weren't part of the government, but also there were diplomats from many different countries who went against the instructions from their capitals to save Jews. So this is very important for us at the State Department to remember, because while diplomats deal with current foreign policy issues, our work needs to be informed by how we see, how we understand, and what we know about the past, so we can try to do better in the future. And obviously, we're far from being perfect. Mass atrocities around the world since the Holocaust have shown us that very clearly. But nonetheless, the U.S. government does try to help save lives, whether it's through peacekeeping operations, through diplomacy, and through education. And the mission of my office, it was created in 1999, is to seek a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors and their heirs. And so we encourage restitution and we support accurate Holocaust remembrance and education. And it's a foreign policy issue because it's a human rights issue, it's a rule of law issue, and it has international dimensions. And of course, with the war in the war in Ukraine, we are reminded again, and obviously what's happening now in Israel and Gaza, it's the moral necessity to provide a measure of justice to all victims, past and present. So in trying to achieve the justice for Holocaust victims, like I said, it's the two main areas, the restitution and commemoration and education. For restitution, it's diplomatic efforts, it's bilateral efforts where we urge foreign governments to find ways to return or to compensate survivors and their heirs for property seized by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Encouraging foreign governments to do the right thing about property that was illegally seized from people who were stripped of their citizenship or deported or murdered, or sometimes all three, is part of our commitment to supporting democracy and promoting respect for human rights and the rule of law. The State Department doesn't deal with individual claims. So if anybody has questions about individual claims, believe it or not, New York State has an office that deals with Holocaust claims. Rather, we've been engaged in the tough process of encouraging these governments to pass laws and set up processes so that those whose property was stolen by the Nazis can actually pursue compensation, and that those proper processes actually deliver. And it's not just for private property, it's also for communal or religious property and movable property, such as art. Restitution or compensation is particularly urgent now, as few survivors remain, and many of them are living in poverty in their old age. Some European countries have done a lot, some a little. And even almost 80 years after the end of World War II, there are still numerous outstanding restitution issues in a variety of countries. In some cases, the ability to claim restitution or compensation is limited by citizenship and residency requirements, like in Croatia, or else there are some complicated administrative barriers. Some countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Belarus, and Ukraine have not even passed legislation that provides for the restitution of private property. And Poland is the only European Union member that has not enacted comprehensive national legislation on private property restitution or compensation covering Holocaust-era property. But U.S. engagement does get results. On the positive side, Lithuania and Latvia last year passed legislation setting up funds to compensate for property seized during the Holocaust era. The funds will help Holocaust survivors and the small remaining Jewish communities in both countries. It includes things like helping to restore Jewish heritage sites and supporting research into the country's Jewish history. And for some survivors or descendants of survivors from Lithuania, there's also a small financial settlement. Last summer, Austria's General Settlement Fund for victims of National Socialism was dissolved after 21 years because they dispersed nearly $215 million to 25,000 beneficiaries. Its task was to acknowledge, through voluntary payments, moral responsibility for asset losses suffered by those persecuted by the National Socialism regime in Austria. And in 2021, Luxembourg completed a comprehensive and creative restitution agreement that settles all heirless property claims, funds Holocaust education and commemoration, and opens a process for such private property matters as dormant bank accounts, insurance policies, and art. For countries that are aspiring to become members of the EU or NATO, dealing with Holocaust restitution issues, as well as ensuring accurate commemoration and education about the Holocaust, are part of showing their commitment to democratic principles that these organizations are based on. The European Union recently adopted its first strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. The strategy has 3 pillars, one of which is education, research, and Holocaust remembrance. It makes promoting Holocaust education, commemoration, and countering Holocaust distortion and denial central parts for the EU. And that brings us to commemoration and education. That's the other important area where Holocaust issues and foreign policy intersect. And as I said before, accurate and factual commemoration and education about the Holocaust is crucial because Holocaust distortion can have tremendous negative effects. International collaboration on countering Holocaust denial and distortion and supporting Holocaust commemoration and education is important in and of itself. because it's important to study the history of an unprecedented attempt to murder all European Jews and erase their culture and history, an attempt that fundamentally challenged human values. Studying the Holocaust is also important because it shows us that genocide is a process that can, maybe, be challenged or even stopped in the future. The U.S. does a lot of work on commemoration and education through our membership in international institutions, such as the 35-nation International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, which today leads the fight against Holocaust distortion and denial and is a major supporter of Holocaust education. IHRA is doing excellent work developing tools and resources for teaching about the Holocaust and identifying and countering Holocaust distortion and denial. The IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism is one that the U.S. embraces and encourages other governments to do so as well. An article in the Jewish News Syndicate of January this year noted that more than 1,000 global entities had adopted the IHRA working definition since 2016. And that includes 18 U.S. states and cities, universities, and organizations, both here and abroad. In addition to the 35 nations who belong to the IHRA, at the United Nations, which has, almost 200 members, only 42, and that's including the IHRA members, have adopted that definition. We also serve on the International Commission of the International Tracing Service, which oversees the Arelson Archives. The Arelson Archives are the world's most comprehensive archives on the Holocaust and all victims and survivors of Nazi persecution. And we pursue foreign policy initiatives like the U.S.-Germany Dialogue on Holocaust Issues, launched in 2021 by Secretary Blinken and then German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas. We're working together with Germany and with our Holocaust Museum and the German Holocaust Museum, the German Foundation Memorial to the murdered Jews, on that, because we want to ensure, even despite Germany having mandatory Holocaust education, we've seen that in polls and surveys that young people still don't have all the facts. So we want to prepare our public servants and the general public to recognize the warning signs of imminent genocide and take action to prevent it. One of the priority areas of this bilateral dialogue is promoting innovative and accurate Holocaust education and training. And to that end, we have just integrated, starting last year, Holocaust education into the flagship program on applied security studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for European Studies for Security Studies, in Garmisch, Germany. And that's a center that's funded by both the American and the German governments. The first year, last year, over 100 senior military and civilian officials from more than 30 countries attended the pilot module, which was designed to help professionals apply lessons from the Holocaust to their own work of protecting life and democratic principles while working in a multinational context. And our colleagues from the Holocaust Museum and the Denkmal, the German museum, just were in Garmisch teaching the second annual curriculum, because now it's going to be a permanent part of that curriculum. Learning from the past, understanding what led to the Holocaust, and reflecting on its lessons and grave consequences is not only about ensuring a better future, but also about safeguarding our open democratic societies and ensuring our security now. Educating adults in positions of authority, whether government, military, law enforcement, or education, is an important part of this effort to counter anti-Semitism. And countering Holocaust denial and distortion, itself a part of anti-Semitism, including at the policy level, matters because, we've seen denial and distortion further perpetuating anti-Semitism. It can fan the flames of violent extremism and threaten our ability to understand and learn from history. An example of Holocaust distortion that we deal with in foreign policy is the rehabilitation of people who played roles in committing the crimes of the Holocaust. And, it's only been 30 years since the Iron Curtain fell, so a lot of countries are just developing their historical narratives. And some historical figures in countries found themselves trapped between Nazi and Soviet aggression and occupation, and they're considered national heroes. But some of those historical leaders also collaborated with the Nazis. Some countries have named streets and sports stadiums after Nazi collaborators, and others downplay or ignore the role of local collaborators in helping to perpetuate the Holocaust as they try to develop a heroic narrative of their national history. You know, in Bulgaria, for example, Bulgaria likes to say that they saved their Jews, and they managed to save Bulgarian Jews, but the Jews in Macedonia, North Macedonia, and Thrace weren't saved. The Bulgarian government at the time allowed them to be deported. So, you know, trying to work with governments and make sure that history is told accurately and honestly. Another way that we support Holocaust education is through exchange programs. The United States has something called the International Visitor Leadership Program at the State Department. And we take groups from all over the world. We've taken groups of teachers, groups of journalists, groups of museum and archivists to come to the States. We did it virtually through COVID, and more recently in person with some group from Latin America. The idea is that they meet each other and they know in different countries who else is working on these issues, and then they hear from different people around the U.S., other Holocaust museums, other communities where there are similar issues, so that they can exchange ideas and learn. And that means teaching the facts of the Holocaust, but also the other genocide and mass killings, as well as teaching tolerance and inclusivity, so that there will hopefully be less discrimination or murders in the world. Because we're the State Department, we don't, work in the U.S. And unfortunately, the Department of Education actually doesn't even dictate curriculum to states. But we are encouraging Holocaust education overseas. And in recent years, many European countries have adopted national action plans to combat anti-Semitism and adopt Holocaust education curricula. And in May, in this country, the Biden-Harris administration released the first U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. It outlines a whole of society approach to tackle anti-Semitism in our country. One of its strategic goals is to increase school-based education about anti-Semitism, including the Holocaust and Jewish American heritage. According to the national strategy, 24 states have Holocaust education mandates, and the majority of states also include Holocaust education as part of their teaching standards. In 2020, Congress passed the Never Again Education Act, which allocates $10 million over the next 5 years to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to develop and distribute Holocaust education resources throughout all 50 states. And I assume the District of Columbia, because that's where I live, even though we're not a state. So you can find it online, and I encourage you to read through it, because, this was an interagency process. So it's not just, the State Department was there, but, it's the Department of Education, Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security. And I know that here in Florida, you're probably ahead of a lot of parts of this country, because it was 30 years ago that there was legislation passed to mandate Holocaust education. And this museum's board chair is active on the Education Task Force on Holocaust education. I think more recently, other states have been taking action. According to an American Jewish Committee, AJC report from last August, 16 U.S. states in 20 to 21 alone introduced state-level Holocaust education legislation. The national strategy also notes, and I quote, that both anti-Semitism and Holocaust education specifically can also teach students about hate, bigotry, racism, and prejudice more broadly. When conducted effectively, Holocaust education provides enduring lessons for all communities, and encourages students to think critically about their own roles and responsibilities to stand up against hate. This education enables students to understand what can happen in a democratic society when hatred goes unchecked, when people are silent as their neighbors are marginalized and murdered. A compilation of efforts nationwide will help states and non-governmental organizations improve and increase teaching about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of hate, bigotry, and genocide. So understanding how teaching Holocaust education can help counter anti-Semitism, as well as other kinds of hate, is important. Our nation and other nations continue to confront many forms of hate, not only anti-Semitism, but racism, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-immigrant hatred, to name a few. Hate can have a corrosive effect on societies, and it is ever more important to preserve open discourse, democratic values, and democratic institutions. I was in Denmark in October for a conference marking the 80th anniversary of the escape of the Danish Jews. And there, educators from Sweden, Denmark, and Norway talked about how to teach about the Holocaust from a Nordic perspective. But their comments really seem to be universally applicable as far as the need to focus on things like critical thinking and democratic values. It's challenging but necessary to make Holocaust education meaningful and inclusive for all students. Using historical methods and dealing with what Holocaust deniers or distorters are saying, as well as dealing with why they are saying such things, matters. And most importantly, these educators talked about meeting students with open minds and encouraging them to explore history. This has become especially timely in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Israel and with Putin's false claims that democratic Ukraine is a hotbed of Nazism. This kind of disinformation detracts from serious and critically important worldwide efforts to combat anti-Semitism. Again, my office supports U.S. government goals of sharing our democratic values and promoting the rule of law and human rights. We use our bilateral and multilateral relationships with allies and international institutions to have everyone try to coalesce around a shared desire to provide justice and redress the wrongs of the Holocaust. We and many others in the State Department work to ensure that U.S. foreign policy supports and reflects America's democratic values. We must learn from the painful lessons of the Holocaust and act in ways that respect the human rights and dignity of all people, including those who look different, pray differently, have different partners. It's the only way we'll ever be able to fulfill the pledge of never again. And it's one of the ways that we can ensure that American policy unites our democratic values with our diplomatic leadership and is centered on the defense of democracy and the protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We're not going to let you go yet. We have some time for questions. We're going to rove, Phil Donahue style. So if you have a question, first, please keep it a question. And second of all, just wait until we come by with the microphone. I have a quick question for you. Possibly a number of questions that you're not allowed to answer, so I won't. I won't ask those. In terms of international affairs, the internet. Are we seeing some of what we're seeing in this country in terms of distortion, propagation of lies and misinformation and disinformation in other countries? And are these efforts crossing borders and boundaries, and are people essentially propagating lies around the country, around these different countries, or are they localized?
No, it's definitely global. And one of the other parts of our, one of the other priorities in our U.S.-Germany dialogue on Holocaust issues is exactly that, Holocaust denial and distortion online. Part of the State Department did a study, not on our own country, but on, with about 7 languages, so Russian, even Farsi, but French, German, Italian, to take a survey of what's out there. And then a German, because we can't look at the US, a German NGO is looking at the US for that. So it's a huge problem. And once that German report is in and we get a chance to study it, the idea is that we can then make policy recommendations for both of our governments on how to work to combat that. But it's a huge problem.
And are there other federal agencies that deal, U.S. agencies that work internationally that you work with directly on certain initiatives and issues?
I don't think so, because the State Department has embassies and consulates all over the world. Those are our main, the ambassadors and the staffers, the officials. They are our main interlocutors. And when I mentioned the two agreements for restitution for Latvia and Lithuania, we couldn't have done that without our ambassadors in each of those countries and our political officers who worked, on the ground with their members of parliament and their government officials to get things done. So really, I think it's, the U.S. Embassy, Foreign Service officers overseas.
Does anyone have questions from the audience? Yes?
Thank you. I have a question that is out of your wheelhouse. So I would understand immediately, and I think everyone would if you didn't want to answer it, but in the spirit of never again, I raised my child in Brookline, Massachusetts, that had one of the first, perhaps the first, Holocaust education in its public schools, and it was a fabulous program. But now, of course, we're seeing so many college students in this country, whether or not they ever had all the kind of Holocaust education that you're talking about. It seems to me that's elementary school, possibly high school. But by the time these kids get to college, far too many of their professors are teaching anti-Semitism, whether directly or indirectly. And I wonder if you see in other countries, or if you know here, where there's a kind of realization of that breaking between younger children and college students, that breaking point, and if there are beginning to be efforts and initiatives to look at that.
So one of the, no, that's fine. And it's totally fair, because I think in other countries, we produce these the State Department does annual human rights reports and international religious freedom reports. And in the religious freedom reports, we look at education, and our embassies help us write these reports, and they're annual reports every year. So one thing that, I've learned over time working on these issues is that, countries may have Holocaust education, but it may just be, a few days or a few hours, in middle school and then in high school. And I happen to agree with, well, I'm not sure if you said that, but I happen to think that we need to start it a lot earlier, because kids aren't born hating, they get it at home. And I'm not an educator, but there has to be some way that we can figure out how to impart these lessons in elementary school, so that by the time they get to middle school or high school, they know what hate is, they know how to, speak out against intolerance, and they can be critical thinkers. And even in Europe, there aren't a lot of graduate level universities with Holocaust education, and that's a real problem too. So I'm not sure I'm giving you hope in any way, but it is something that we're looking at, and some countries are grappling with this in the education systems. There's someone up front.
Yes.
Here you go.
Are you able to get education, Holocaust education in Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia or the Middle East?
Here's something pretty interesting. Of course, it might all be dashed with what's going on now, but the Abraham Accords really helped to open things up to some degree. And Deborah Lipstadt, Ambassador Lipstadt, has been spending a lot of her time in places like Morocco and Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf countries. And the UAE, for example, colleagues of mine from the Holocaust Museum were just, I mean, the timing was unbelievable because they arrived on the 8th. But the plan is for they talked to one of the academies where UAE diplomats are being trained to talk about, Holocaust education. The Holocaust Museum does a lot of that, adult education, law enforcement and military, and working with other countries, other diplomatic countries. So I think it's not as dire as one would think, although I think all bets are off right now, just given the conflict. But Morocco has done a lot and is more open, and Morocco actually they played a part in rescuing some Jews during the Holocaust. And last year, for the first time, I think Egypt and the UAE had International Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorations on January 27th for that. A survivor went with some folks from the Holocaust Museum, and our embassies were involved. And there was almost something in Saudi this year. So there's hope.
In Poland, they passed a law that you're not allowed to say that Polish people collaborated with the Nazis.
I know. And it will be interesting to see with the new government if anything happens, because Poland is one of those countries that also hasn't done restitution.
I know.
Are you Polish originally?
I was born in Poland. I'm not Polish.
Okay, that's what I meant. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay. All right. There we go. First of all, thank you for this and the work that you've been doing. It's really important. Holocaust education is critical, but I want to say it needs to go beyond that, is because the threats that the Jewish people face today are from people who know about the Holocaust. And I've talked to some of them, had long conversations with them, and say, yeah, the Holocaust was terrible, but, right? And there's always this but, and then there's this whole typical, we all know the whole series of complaints and myths and whatever. And that's where I think that more emphasis needs to be done, is what's going on now. Because if you want to, you want to get ahead of the genocides, and you want to teach about how to recognize the indicators for it. I think that's something that needs to be done, and a little bit more attention. I mean, I've seen news reports about genocides on in history, but the Israelis have been under threat of genocide for decades, and that's just not really talked about. And they're tried to institute that a few weeks ago, and it's that there's that whole history that's just not discussed or not recognized. Some of us here may know about it, but a lot of people do not.
Well, I think that different countries, there's not one blueprint for how to teach Holocaust education. And I think with currently, a lot of it has to do with blaming individual Jews for the actions of the state of Israel. And that's problematic. That's why it's laid out in the working definition by the IRA. And there are even dueling definitions, people who think that that cuts down on free speech, but it really doesn't. It just says that you shouldn't blame individual Jews for actions, policies of the state of Israel. You shouldn't demonize Israel because of its actions when you're not, calling out other countries. And, you shouldn't hold it to a double standard that they should be better than others. So, there are really creative NGOs. I know an American expat who runs an NGO called Centropa out of Vienna, and he has a whole network of teachers in Central Europe, including related to German, Israeli, and American teachers. And most of these people aren't Jewish, but they come together every summer for a teachers academy. But then they also go to their towns where they're teaching, and they encourage kids to learn about how Jews lived in their towns. And then the kids actually make presentations, whether it's in City Hall or to the school. So the kids get it, the teachers are guiding them. So those are ways to show who Jews are.
And the Florida Holocaust Museum works with Central.
Oh,
I
that's
was
good.
going to say,
And just, from what I've looked at on your website, it's, the Florida Holocaust Museum does a tremendous amount with, there was just an article about, some Catholic or Christian school kids coming here, and, all of that stuff is important. Everything.
we have a question over here. Yeah.
I just want to go back to the education piece that people are talking about. I worked for Anti-Defamation League in Boston, and I taught a world of difference training. That we went into high schools and taught all kinds of racism and all of that. And they train and have workshops for people to get involved and do the education. If we keep looking to government to do everything for us and do things like that, it's a long wait, right? There's a big agenda. So I encourage people to get involved in doing education on the local level, and there's these training programs that people can get certified and go into schools and, do the trainings. I don't think there's any educational requirement. I don't know if ADL's even active anywhere.
ADL is really active
here in St. Petersburg.
Oh, but
or in
I mean,
Florida.
around
I know
the
in
country,
Boston it was
because, with law enforcement, and there's a little card that the ADL had done. So yes, we really rely on NGO partners like the ADL and the AJC and whatnot. And what's interesting is, somewhat related to the event you're going to have this weekend, there are new groups starting with second and third generation survivors, and they're also independent, but the people who are starting them are trying to get them to do the same thing, train them to go into schools and talk to people. So yeah, everything counts, everything matters.
I think we have a question right here. I'm going to make sure this is working first.
You were wonderful, number one. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
very much. But even more important than that, where and how can the UN be educated in Holocaust?
That's this is very good, because it was it last year or the year before that someone named Miguel Moratinos was appointed by the Secretary General to take action on this. And with Deborah Lipstadt, as the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, she has been working really closely with him and others in the UN system. They're talking about how to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And even a few years ago, I'm trying to remember his name, someone in the UN did a report on anti-Semitism, like a lot of European countries, but he was doing it globally and what needed to be done. And that report has gotten a lot of press. So even if you're not hearing about it, things are going on behind the scenes. And the UN is trying to come to terms with this and have more of a positive role.
I think we have time.
I don't.
Sorry.
to tell you.
Didn't. Go ahead.
No, I don't.
I think that was a rhetorical question. We
Yeah,
have time.
this I really like a lot. This is an ADL survey that was done in 2020. They talked to college students, American college students, so these are kids who had had Holocaust education in high school. So there are some positive, Holocaust education can have a positive impact.
We have time for a couple more questions.
I find the reference to the United Nations always interesting, but I think back to the 1948 UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, Article 7 of which says that any individual, group, or nation that promotes the idea of genocide is committing the crime of genocide. So you have the charters of Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the PLO, and the rantings of Iran calling for genocide. Iran was a signatory to the convention. So the question I have is, if the legal mechanism is there, why isn't it being applied, especially to Hamas currently, which openly states that we want to kill every Jew in Israel?
I think I don't know. I'm not an expert on that, but also a lot of the organizations besides Iran are non-state actors, and that makes things a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Okay. I have a question that's more domestic, but it could be also international. I was just listening to a radio program where they're equating what's happening with the Palestinians in Gaza and calling that genocide. And I know that's here locally, and I think also internationally. I was wondering, how do we address this equivalency that that people are trying to say to it, that what Israel's doing to in Gaza is equivalent to a genocide?
I think that's being worked on right now because it's all so new, and I see that as Holocaust distortion because someone earlier said you can't compare anything to the Holocaust, but that's what's happening is so new that I don't think anything has been determined yet on how we fight back against that. Sorry.
Okay, Stacy Bernard Davis, thank you so much for being here with us. We'll be here for a little bit if people want to talk to you. And again, thank you all for being here. Have a great night.